Thank you again to joining our webinar, No Toxics on Tap. I'm Jeanette Gare. I'm the director of Environment Georgia, which is a nonprofit that works to protect the beautiful green spaces that we have in Georgia, as well as the clean air that we all breathe and the clean water that we all drink and recreate in. And I am excited to be here with our speakers to talk about forever chemicals, also known as PFAS. So what I'm going to do is introduce our speakers today, and also run through our agenda in the process. And then we'll have lots of time at the end for Q&A. So if you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat for our speakers, and we'll get to them at the end. Or speakers, if you see something that you can address as we're moving through and along, feel free to grab something. So diving in, we're going to start with Rachel Rogers, who is a toxicologist based in Atlanta. She has a PhD in computational toxicology. She formerly worked on PFAS issues with the CDC. And Rachel's going to take some time to basically set the stage for us. So she's going to talk about what are PFAS, why should we be concerned, what's some of the science and history of our studies around PFAS, and then a little bit about what's going on at the federal level in terms of regulating these chemicals. Then we're going to hand it over to Jessie DeMondbruin Chapman, who, in addition to having an excellent surname, is also the executive director and riverkeeper with the Coosa River Basin Initiative. He serves on the Georgia Water Coalition's leadership team with me, and the Georgia Water Coalition, for folks who don't know, is a coalition of, I believe, over 250 organizations, clubs, church groups, businesses, etc., that all work together to protect Georgia's waterways. Jessie actually chairs the PFAS committee that the Georgia Water Coalition has, and has over a decade, or around a decade, working on PFAS issues in Georgia. And then and Jesse's going to take some time talking about what are some of the PFAS issues that are happening in Georgia right now. So what's going on at the state legislature that folks should know about to deal with this issue. And then we're going to transition into talking, sharing sort of news that you can use. So some tips to avoid PFAS. I'll introduce Lauren Kirshner, who is an investigative reporter with Consumer Reports, one of my favorite publications. She covers product safety, and her investigations have revealed the risks posed by dangerous toys and other children's products. She's exposed contaminants in food and reported on threats to safe drinking water. So Lauren has some tips and some Consumer Report tools that can help you make sure that you don't have PFAS in your drinking water. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about what are some tips to avoid PFAS in some of the things that we use every day, so cookware, etc. And then we'll have plenty of time, I think, for Q&A. So that's our agenda. Thank you all again for being here on a Friday afternoon, and I am going to go ahead and hand it off to Rachel.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeanette. Do we have my first slide? I'm not sure which one you're starting with.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. So my name is Rachel Rogers, and I'm so glad to be with you today to talk a little bit about PFAS. I'm here today representing myself, but I come to you with nearly 2 decades of experience working at the CDC and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, where until somewhat recently, I served as the scientific lead and technical subject matter expert for PFAS. My academic training, as Jeanette mentioned, is in computational toxicology, where I also focused on PFAS. And I've spent the vast majority of my career working in communities that have been impacted by PFAS contamination. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kick things off with a little bit of an introduction to PFAS. I'll talk about what they are, a little bit of history about how we came to know and care about them. I'll give a little bit of background on some of the earliest investigations that led us to the understanding that we currently have. And then I'll finish up with an overview of the federal response to PFAS up till present day. Next slide. So what are PFAS? I want to start off by just addressing the fact that PFAS is a very strange acronym. It stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It sounds like it's just one chemical, PFAS, but it is actually plural. It represents an entire class of chemicals. It depends on the precise definition that you're using, but it's generally estimated that there are more than 9,000 individual PFAS. The class is characterized by a carbon chain that's either partially or fully fluorinated. So where you would have hydrogen atoms, instead you have fluorine atoms. That carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest in organic chemistry, and as a result, PFAS have many unique properties. They repel both water and oil, which makes them particularly well-suited for use as surfactants and dispersants, and they're also used in certain types of firefighting foams as well as in consumer products. PFAS are also remarkably persistent, both in the environment and in people's bodies. Once PFAS are released into the environment, they, generally speaking, do not break down or degrade. And when people are exposed to them, they tend to stick around, bound to proteins and circulating in the blood. Next slide. So this schematic illustrates how PFAS can get into the environment. Manufacturing sites can contaminate the ground or surface water. Wastewater treatment plants can discharge PFAS into source waters. In the past, contaminated biosolid sludge from water treatment facilities has been spread on agricultural fields as soil amendment, which leads to contamination of the groundwater. Groundwater and surface water can become contaminated when certain kinds of firefighting foams are discharged into the environment or when PFAS-containing consumer products are disposed of in landfills. All of these things lead to the potential contamination of drinking water from private wells and municipal systems. People can be exposed to PFAS when they use consumer products that contain PFAS or when they consume food that was grown or raised in PFAS-contaminated areas. Next slide. So PFAS development and use in the United States has a long and important history. PFAS were first synthesized in the 1930s and 1940s, and by the 1950s, large-scale production of PFAS was well underway. Beginning in 1968, a few very early studies reported PFAS detections in human blood samples. PFAS manufacturing peaked between 1970 and 2000, and somewhere in that time frame, preliminary toxicity studies began to suggest that PFAS may have the potential to cause adverse health effects in rats and in mice. Samples collected by the CDC's National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, also known as NHANES, in 1999 revealed that more than 98% of people tested had some PFAS in their blood, suggesting that exposure to these chemicals was widespread. In 2006, 8 major PFAS manufacturers voluntarily began to phase out PFOA and related compounds as part of the EPA's PFOA stewardship program. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. Next slide. So one of the initial investigations of PFAS exposure in the United States was drinking water sampling that was conducted in accordance with the EPA's third unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. This program required that all public water systems serving more than 10,000 people, as well as 800 smaller systems, monitor for 30 contaminants, including 6 PFAS, that were not at that time regulated. And this sampling occurred between 2013 and 2015. So of approximately 51,000 community water systems in the United States, you see that over on the left-hand side of the slide, of those 51,000 community water systems, 4,800 were sampled. Of those, 129 had detections of PFAS. 65 systems had detections that were above the EPA's health advisory for PFOA or PFOS at that time. So that represents about 6 million people. But it's very important to note here that the public water systems that were not tested serve about 60 million people. And that doesn't even include the 33 to 38 million people who get their water from private wells. So this was a pretty eye-opening moment for the public health community. And while this initial exposure investigation really gave us a sense of the extent of the exposure problem, it really wasn't even a comprehensive picture. Next slide. Oh, there should be a graphic on this one, Jeanette. Are you seeing that?
I'm not.
Oh, that's sad. Okay, that's all right. We'll just listen close, and I'll tell you what the data would have what you would have seen. So another important initial investigation was the measurement of PFAS in samples collected by that study I mentioned, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, aka NHANES. So since 1999, NHANES has measured PFAS in the blood of the general U.S. population. So like I mentioned, this study was the first to document widespread exposure to PFAS in the United States. PFAS were measured in more than 98% of blood samples that were collected from the U.S. population. Oh, there it is. Yay. Okay, so PFAS were measured in more than 98% of the blood samples that were collected from the general US population at that time. So this work also shed light on exposure trends in the US population. So since 2002, when those 8 manufacturers began to phase out PFOA and related compounds, the use of PFOS and PFOA has declined in the United States. As the use of those compounds declined, we see that blood levels are going down as well. So that's the data that you see here on the slide. You can see that from 1998 to 2018, blood PFOS levels declined by more than 80%, while blood PFOA levels declined by more than 60%. So that's great. Two other species that we talk about a lot, PFHXS and PFNA, show less of a change over time. So this could be due to greater persistence in the body and thus a slower response to changes in manufacturing and use, or it could be due to other factors that we're just still trying to understand. Next slide, please. So the C8 Health Project was another important early investigation. This large epidemiological study gathered information on over 60,000 people who were living in a community near the DuPont Washington Works facility in West Virginia, which was a population that was found to have high levels of PFAS in their drinking water. The settlement of a lawsuit resulted in the establishment of what's called the C8 Science Panel, which was charged with assessing the links between PFOA exposure and a number of different diseases. The work of the C8 Science Panel resulted in numerous publications, and it really laid the foundation for what we now know about the relationship between PFAS exposure and the potential for adverse health effects. The team reported on what were called probable links between exposure and health outcomes, but it's important to note here that the term probable link is a legally defined term. It is not a scientific one. So these were health conditions for which a connection to PFOA exposure was determined by the panel to be more likely than not. The panel found probable links between PFOA exposure and 6 different health outcomes. Those were high cholesterol, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, testicular cancer, kidney cancer, and pregnancy-induced hypertension. Next slide. Great. So it feels like we are learning more and refining our understanding of the potential for health effects from PFAS in humans every day. The literature on this topic is extremely dynamic. Currently, the scientific research that we have gives us evidence that suggests that PFAS may impact many different parts of the body. The challenge is that there are many, many different kinds of PFAS, over 9,000, right? And only a very small handful have really been studied very extensively. In general, animal studies have found that animals exposed to PFAS at high levels saw changes in the function of the liver, thyroid, pancreas, and hormone levels. And in humans, studies have shown that certain PFAS may affect different systems in the body, including that exposure may lead to increased cholesterol, changes in liver enzymes, decreased immune response to vaccines in children, increased risk of high blood pressure or preeclampsia in pregnant women, small decreases in infant birth weight, and increased risk of kidney or testicular cancer. So again, this is an area of ongoing research, and the more research that we get, the better we understand more fully how the full spectrum of PFAS may be affecting human health. Next slide. Okay, and so I'm just going to wrap it up with a little bit of an overview on the federal response to PFAS. In addition to those early investigations that I mentioned, the federal response to concerns about PFAS really began to accelerate around 2015 and 2016. So in May of 2016, the US EPA issued lifetime health advisories for PFOS and PFOA of 70 parts per trillion, either individually or combined. 2 years later, the 2018 omnibus bill was signed into law, which provided $10 million to CDC and ATSDR to conduct PFAS exposure assessments and a multi-site health study across the country. And this work is actually wrapping up kind of as we speak, and it's already been extremely helpful for understanding both exposure to PFAS as well as the human health risks. In April of 2024, the EPA designated PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, which is known as CERCLA. And that has important implications for cleanup of PFAS contamination. They also announced the first ever drinking water regulations for PFAS under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And in doing so, they set drinking water limits for PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS, PFNA, and a couple of others in drinking water. That was really exciting. Now, just a year later, in May of 2025, in response to shifting federal priorities, the US EPA announced that it will retain the regulatory limits for PFOS and PFOA, but extend their compliance deadlines. And they also announced that they plan to rescind and reconsider the regulatory determinations for all of the others. So at the current moment, things are a bit up in the air, and the public health community is facing a fair amount of confusion, but the work continues. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I will pass the mic on over to the next panelist.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm gonna unpin you and then hand it off to Jesse. Oh, and my cat has joined the chat. We did have one question. Will this be recorded and shared? Yes, we are recording. I'm going to work on getting it up on our website over the weekend and share it out early next week. So answering that easy question first. And now handing it off to Jesse.
Thank you, Jeanette. So we're going back to the PFAS cycle a little bit. I want to give some background on what has been occurring in Georgia and what we at the Georgia Water Coalition are endeavoring to do at the legislature. The kind of Cliff Notes version of this diagram here is basically identifying that our conventional treatment methods for PFAS are broadly ineffective. These are very tricky compounds to capture. And once they make it into the environment, due to their persistent nature, they tend to just kind of spread all over. And what I like in this too, because I have kids, is basically trying to give a toddler a napkin to clean up spaghetti sauce. They're not going to be super effective at it, and they're just kind of going to smear it around. And so once the compounds essentially enter into that wastewater treatment plant that you see in the middle of the diagram there, whether you're sending leachate or sludge to a landfill, whether you're land applying it, basically none of these traditional wastewater treatment methods are sequestering these compounds, and they are getting into the environment through direct discharges of wastewater, through the application of biosolids onto fields, and then it's infiltrating and contaminating soil and groundwater. Um, Basically, all of these ways that we typically manage waste are spreading PFAS, kind of broadcasting them across the environment. I put some examples of note over on the side. So up here in Northwest Georgia, we have had a lot of carpet and textile industry for decades. And in the cases of both Dalton and Calhoun, the industrial users of these chemicals had what we call pre-treatment permits. So these companies, instead of treating their wastewater and having their own discharge permit to send their wastewater into a stream, they have a permit to send their wastewater to a wastewater treatment plant that is publicly owned. And then it becomes that municipality's responsibility to treat the wastewater and discharge it. Um, in the case of both Dalton and Calhoun, the wastewater that had PFAS in it was sent to publicly owned treatment works that did not have the technology in place to remove these chemicals. And so you ended up with this PFAS cycle in both of those locations, where regardless of whether they're sending it to a landfill or biosolids to a land application site, they're basically just kind of spreading the PFAS around across the environment, which has led to widespread contamination of soil, groundwater, and surface water across Northwest Georgia. Jeanette, I think if you advance the slide, a circle is going to pop up. Maybe.
It's showing up on my screen. Is it not showing up
Oh,
on your
there it
screen?
is. There it is. It came back. So our focus has really been trying to identify ways of controlling these compounds at the source. You know, as I've described, once they reach the public sewer, they are really difficult to control. And bringing technology online to capture this very specific industrial pollutant is quite expensive. And that burden would fall on ratepayers. So everybody who is tapped into the public sewer rather than industry itself. So our goal is to focus on that key relationship that you see circled. It is the relationship between the industrial users of these compounds. So these are the companies that are making a profit off of the use of PFAS, and the relationship they have with the publicly owned treatment works that are tasked with treating that wastewater. So you can hop to the next slide, Jeanette. So we have introduced the Forever Chemicals Transparency Act, which is House Bill 611. And our goal is to promote transparency on that relationship. So basically, it requires companies to disclose to the locally owned treatment works that have a pre-treatment program. They have to disclose if they are intentionally using PFAS or they suspect that they are passing PFAS on to the public sewer through their wastewater. Currently, under Georgia law, they are not compelled to share that information. And we think that that is a tremendous regulatory gap. It is unreasonable to think that these publicly owned treatment works and the employees that work there can protect the environment, our drinking water resources from these compounds if they don't at the very beginning know that they're being sent these compounds. So our goal in compelling industry to disclose that they are sending PFAS to the public sewer is that that improved access to information will spark creative solutions that communities can address for themselves how they want to move forward, identifying ways to remove these compounds safely so that they're not spread, across the environment through the application of biosolids and through direct discharge of wastewater. This will protect, in addition to the environment and our drinking water resources, it also has the effect of shielding ratepayers, homeowners that would bear the burden of utility costs if they were responsible for paying for the technology needed to remove these compounds. And the reason why this is important beyond Northwest Georgia is an excellent case study because these industries have been here for so long. But due to the utility of these compounds in a broad array of manufacturing scenarios, a lot of emerging industries are finding utility in PFAS. A lot of industries that we don't think to look at. So it's easy to think, ooh, if there's a carpet manufacturer, we need to look for PFAS there. The problem is if we don't start to address this knowledge gap, we are going to find future sites of contamination based on other industries that are beginning to heavily use these compounds that we don't automatically think we need to really be paying attention there. And so our hope is that this bill will spark some transparency in that relationship and help communities across the state have more forward-thinking plans for how they're going to address this pollutant in their water resources. And I will send it back over to you, Jeanette, unless there are any questions.
Well, there are, and I'm actually going to break the rule that I set at the beginning of this and say, why don't we just take a couple minutes to answer? There's like two kind of technical questions that I think we should go ahead and answer. So the first, Rachel, I know you put this in the chat, but can you go ahead and maybe answer it in the Zoom? And the question was, where do the MCLs currently stand? So remind us what MCL is and share where they stand.
Yeah, absolutely. So MCL stands for maximum contaminant level, and these are the EPA's drinking water standards. They are regulatory standards that were promulgated in 2024, and they basically set the limit that water systems are required to keep PFAS below. My understanding, and like I said in my presentation, it is a bit confusing right now, maybe less so to others, but my understanding is that they are currently in place. The MCLs are currently in place. They were finalized in 2024 and they remain. What complicates the question is that as the final rule that was released in 2024 was written, water systems are not required to immediately comply with the MCLs. The way it is kind of a graduated process where the first thing that happens is water systems are required to conduct monitoring to sort of assess what the levels are to begin with, and then the compliance deadlines come later. And so my understanding is that the rule is still in place, and so water systems should be monitoring. But the actual compliance deadlines have been extended. And so, again, that I think is definitely true for PFOA and PFOS. I believe it is still true for the other PFAS as well, although our current EPA has expressed an intention to rescind the MCLs for all PFAS other than PFOA and PFOS. So what that means for the future is a bit up in the air.
And then have a question from Michael. Given that these compounds are not very water soluble, how readily do they leach through soils? Likewise, since they are not water or fat soluble, do they cross cell membranes?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I don't know, Jesse, maybe you want to take that one too. But what I can say is that PFAS structurally are so interesting in that they are both hydrophobic and hydrophilic. They repel both fats and water, and that's unusual. When you get a bunch of them together, they form what's called a micelle, and basically that means their tails kind of all point into the center, and the heads of the structure all kind of form it's basically like a bubble, I think, for lack of a better term. And because of this micelle formulation, they do move through soils. They do kind of percolate through the soils and into groundwater, and that's why we have issues with groundwater contamination. In terms of their behavior in the human body and whether or not they cross cell membranes, PFAS are I'm speaking generally here. There are thousands of these compounds and they behave differently. So not all of them behave exactly the same way, but generally speaking, and definitely for the long chain PFAS like PFOA, these chemicals are very, very heavily bound to the serum albumin. And so 99% of the PFAS in the body at any given time are bound to serum albumin and circulating in the blood. Now, they do participate in active transport. So there are certain transporters that are expressed on the membranes, cell membranes, that actively move PFAS through those membranes. So that's kind of how it works. And it's really interesting and complicated. We can talk more about it, but hopefully that answers the question.
Good. And we're starting to get questions that I think get into some of the stuff that Lauren's going to talk about. So I am going to go ahead and move us forward, and hand things off to you, Lauren.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me. Um, I am a journalist at Consumer Reports magazine. And if you're not familiar with Consumer Reports, we've been going strong since the 30s. We're celebrating our 90th anniversary this year, which is kind of mind-boggling. And Consumer Reports is a magazine. It is a website. It's also an advocacy organization. They're kind of like two halves. And so we report the news about consumer issues and safety. I focus on product safety and environmental health. Um, and then the advocacy wing of Consumer Reports also lobbies the government, the federal government, state governments, and pushes for corporations and manufacturers to make their products safer and better and make the marketplace better for everyone. We're a nonprofit. We never take ads. We buy all our own stuff, all the cars, all the tires, all the toasters, all the fridges. But getting into today's topic, we also test water filters and we even test kits for testing your own water at home. So if you're curious about the quality of your water in your house, there's a couple things you can do to get started. Um, so the first thing that you probably should do is to look up online. There's some caveats, but most people should be able to look up their community confidence report, which would come out every year, and they either come to your house or you can look them up online. If you rent, you can ask your landlord for access to it. And that will tell you the source of your water that comes out of your tap, and what your municipality tests for. Now, they don't necessarily test for everything, but what they do test for and what their results are. And you can go back in time and see how that may have changed. What your municipality tests for will depend on where you live and your local situation, and varies by states. You may see PFAS there, you may not. I mean, you all are in Georgia. You can jump in and tell me what you know about Georgia, because I don't have Georgia specific knowledge, but that will give you a start. It won't necessarily tell you if you don't have a PFAS problem, but it will tell you if you do have a PFAS problem. Now, if you get your water from a well and not a municipal source, then the water quality is really up to you. So if you're on well water, or if you're just more curious about the water that you get out of your tap and you would like to test your water yourself, Consumer Reports does not recommend ever using those test strips that you get from the hardware store that you dip in and see like what's in my water. We find that those are not really reliable. You can send off your water to an EPA certified lab that you can see listed there on that website, or you can do your own mail-in test kits. And the three test kits that I have listed here on the slides are the ones that performed well in Consumer Reports tests. So Consumer Reports, took a water sample and sent it to like an official third-party lab, and then sent another sample through this test kit system and found that their results matched. So the one that I've used myself in my house is Cyclopure. The price is actually outdated. It's now $85, but I found it to be really easy. It's just this little cup. You put water in, it sort of drips down. You send in the empty cup that's sort of absorbed the stuff, and you put it in the mail. And they test for 55 different PFAS compounds. Now, another caveat, as Rachel said, there are what 9,000 compounds. And so they're only focusing on some, but they're focusing on like the big bad ones that we know the most about. Um, let's see. Yes, so that's pretty much it. And on the next slide, we'll talk about filters. If you would like to filter your water, your next step would be what type of filter would be best for the type of contamination you're dealing with, and also what format the filter should be in. All of these types have different pros and cons. The water filter pitcher is the one you might think of first, the Brita type thing that comes in and out of your fridge or lives on your um, countertop. Very easy to get started, pretty cheap. You do need to keep refilling it, which is kind of a pain. You do need to buy new filters. It's not just a one-time investment, it's kind of an ongoing thing. Some of them do filter out PFAS and some of them do not. And I'll tell you in a bit like how you can tell. Faucet mounted water filters work with the same technology, the carbon filter, but it's just directly on your faucet. It kind of slows down your flow a little bit. You do have to replace the filters every once in a while, but it's about the same financial investment for that. Let's see. Reverse osmosis and under sink water filters are less DIY. They're gonna require some installation help. A plumber can come in. Under sink water filter would just filter just the one tap, like the kitchen sink, for instance, if that's where you're filling up your water bottles and drinking from and cooking from. Reverse osmosis, sometimes those you can get a system that filters your whole house if you would rather do that. Refrigerator water filters, those are also super easy to use and cheap to replace. But they're going to be less effective than, the reverse osmosis, which instead of using just simple carbon filtration, reverse osmosis is a more thorough process where it's forcing the water through this like membrane filter with really high pressure, and filtering out the contaminants that way. It also produces a lot of wastewater. So some people don't like that because it's sort of wasting water while you're filtering out the bad stuff to get your good water. Um, so this is a lot of information, but on the next slide, I'll show you rather than getting into the nitty-gritty of brands and models, I thought I would just direct you to two really great resources that Consumer Reports has. The first one, the buying guide, will sort of walk you through the pros and cons in a more detailed way of what filter format would be right for you based on what contamination you think you're dealing with. And then also, it's not all about contamination, also just like taste and smell and sort of like the feel of your water can be a factor too in choosing what filter you might want. And then for the PFAS specific guide, CR broke out, for the filters that are good for PFAS, which ones do we recommend in terms of like ease of use and price and those kinds of things. And we have a recommendation for all of the different formats. The one exception is the refrigerator water filters. Those tests we're still working on, and those results are not yet on our site, but we have ratings and reviews and details about the other types of formats. Now, if you're just out there shopping on your own, and you want to make sure the filter that you're choosing uh, is is right for filtering out PFAS specifically, you want to look for these certifications. These are, independent third-party certification organizations that will make sure that the filter is right for filtering out PFAS. So you want to look for those phrases and numbers there. I think that's pretty much all I had, so I'll pass it back to you, Jeanette.
Thank you, Lauren. Um, and I am going to dive into a little bit more. There we go. Information about, so Jesse, I thought did a great job of just explaining, why HB611, but then also explaining that different types of PFAS, so not just PFOS and PFOA, are being used in other types of manufacturing, and are potentially showing up in the environment, in our water, being spread on land, etc. One of the best ways that we could put an end to that is to stop using products that contain PFAS. And so my tips there's sort of two, reasons behind these tips. One is to avoid PFAS in your own home, but then the other is to start to end the use of this chemical or these chemicals in the products that we use. So there's sort of two benefits that come um, with avoiding PFAS. So I'm going to advance. So let's talk about cookware. Um, the first easy rule of thumb is to avoid um, Teflon pans. Avoid pans that come with words like non-stick, stain-proof, grease-resistant, or waterproof because they are probably coated with PTFE, commonly known as Teflon. Um, these pans do a great job of making sure your eggs don't stick, but overheating or scratching the pan can start to damage that coating, that PTFE, and increase the chance that PFAS-laced particles or fumes are actually ending up in your food or your air. So if you go shopping for a new nonstick frying pan, you, well, first of all, might see claims like Teflon free or PFOA and PFOS free. But reminder that those are only, two types of PFAS. There are other PFAS that could be used in your frying pan. And so we recommend that folks look at some of these alternatives, alternative coatings or alternative materials when shopping for cookware. So ceramic, stainless steel, cast iron, and carbon steel. Things like cast iron, once they're seasoned, can become nonstick, so can accomplish the same thing, but also sometimes take a little bit more care, or like I said, seasoning. Moving on to food packaging. So historically, paper food packaging like hamburger wrappers were actually treated with PFAS to stop things like, the grease from the hamburger from soaking through. Um, but the good news is PFAS is now not used in paper food packaging nationwide. However, the prohibition specifically applies to PFAS used to make things grease resistant. So the chemical could still be used in the actual inks or other types of packaging. So what we recommend is for paper packaging, look for products that are certified by the Biodegradable Products Institute or BPI, which is required that all compostable food packaging be PFAS free. And then when you can, if you're using, instead of using a parchment paper, use a silicone baking sheet or metal. Getting into cleaning products. So some cleaning products rely on fluorinated ingredients. To avoid them, you can look for cleaners that have some of these different seals that certify them to be PFAS free. So the green seal, the Safer Choice seal, the Eco Logo seal are all seals that signal that these products have been tested by programs um, that are testing for and making sure that you are not using products with PFAS. Better yet, you can keep it simple. Soap, water, a little patience, a really good brush can do a lot of the cleaning jobs that you need to do better than a fancy chemical can. Often a simple mix of like baking soda and hydrogen peroxide or using white vinegar can offer a low cost, PFAS free cleaning solution that does the trick. Moving on to clothing. So, outdoor gear is commonly coated with a durable water repellent, and many of those repellents or finishes actually use PFAS. So, for example, Gore-Tex, which a lot of us have heard of, is waterproof fabric made with PTA. The good news is that there are more and more PFAS-free jackets that are widely available and are clearly labeled. And there are some clothing companies like REI and Patagonia that have committed to being PFAS-free. So I recommend a quick Google to find some of the best options that are out there. This is an example of one that I found last year. So there are options. Google for PFAS-free raincoats or outdoor gear. Personal care and cosmetics. So I'll talk just about a few products here. Um, Dental floss. So unfortunately, floss that has water resistance or kind of that slick gliding feel often uses PFAS to accomplish that water resistance. And there are a lot of brands, well-known brands, of floss products that have been found to have PFAS. So this is a big one since dental floss goes straight into your mouth and makes contact with your gums. So encourage folks to look for PFAS, or not PFAS, but look for PFAS-free dental floss. Um, Alternatives like that are made out of silk or cotton or plant-based floss or are usually safer, but still check to make sure that the packaging is labeled PFAS-free. Another good thing to look for is floss that's biodegradable or come in refillable glass containers. Consumer Reports, I think Lauren actually has a guide of the best and worst floss products. Um, and I think what I should have said at the beginning was we'll share, when we stop sharing my screen, we'll share some of the links that Lauren has and links that I have in the chat for folks. Makeup. So PFAS unfortunately can be found in makeup, including things like waterproof mascara and some lipsticks that help. PFAS actually helps to increase color retention. So one of the best tips that I have is to use the Environmental Working Group's Skin Deep database that actually has dozens and dozens of products that the Environmental Working Group is testing regularly to make sure do or do not contain PFAS. All right. And last one, children's products or other home products. So any product, unfortunately, that is identified as stain resistant or waterproof can and probably does have PFAS. So that includes like clothes, mattresses, pillow covers, bibs, carpets, rugs. So best thing to do is to look for, again, some of these third-party verifications that are actually doing the work to make sure that there are not intentionally added PFAS to some of the products that you might be looking to buy. So again, we're going to share some like buying guides in the chat in just a moment. But I mean, one of the things that the takeaway from this, I don't want the takeaway to be let's go out and spend a ton of money on new products. That I don't think that should be the takeaway. What I would recommend is that you prioritize products that you put on your face, that come in contact with food, so that you can reduce your exposure without spending a fortune replacing everything in your home. And then reminder as you do buy things to find ways to buy things without PFAS as a way to really use consumer power to reduce the use of PFAS in manufacturing. Um, okay. Now I'm going to stop share. There we go. I do think we have some questions. So now we're going to use the chat function to answer some questions. And then I'll also, as people are answering questions, drop some things in the chat. Okay. If we already have, so Nellie asked, if we already have Teflon pans, how should we best dispose of them? What a great question. Here we go, pasting things in the chat. The best answer to that is to make sure that you are sending it to a landfill. The landfill will hopefully have a system that catches any water that like filtrates out of that landfill. And then if we pass HB 611, the really good news is if that landfill is sending things to a water treatment facility, sending that like water that's filtrated out of the landfill, if they're sending things to a water treatment facility, they would need to let the water treatment facility know that they are sending the water treatment facility things that have PFAS in them, perhaps because, you know, they have old frying pans in them. And, you know, then we'd be able to deal with that contamination. So two-part answer. One, pass HB 611. Two, you know, make sure it responsibly ends up in a landfill. Okay. Chapstick. Consumer Reports. Lauren, have you guys done anything on chapstick?
I was just looking through our archives. I don't think so, but that's such a good idea. Because of course you use it so frequently, it goes on your face and in your mouth. We just did a best lip balms thing, but it wasn't looking specifically at contaminants or PFAS. It was just sort of the best feeling lip balms. So I'm going to take that idea and recommend it to my colleagues because that's a really good idea.
All right, so stay tuned. And then I posted in the chat to share with folks Consumer Reports. The first link I think is the dental floss link. The second one is pans. And then our sister organization, PERG, has a great guide reducing PFAS in your home that I want to make sure we share. Let me see if there's anything else that I wanted to share. Oh, definitely. Okay. I have a little call to action for everyone. I should have posted this 3 times. I'm sharing now in the chat a website, a link to our website and an action page for HB 611. So as Jesse mentioned, this is legislation that's pending before the General Assembly. The General Assembly is in session now. They started last week, which means we have 40 session days, roughly until kind of early April, to actually pass HB 611 or the language that's in 611. We don't have to necessarily pass the bill. We can just take the language, put it somewhere else. But getting folks to ask their legislator to help move this legislation is really important. So please, if you don't take anything else away from this webinar, I hope that you will take a minute to go to that website and send a note to your legislator asking them to pass HB 611. So those are the links that you see in the chat. All right, let me see if there's anything that I've missed. We got recording. Yes, we're recording this. I'll work on getting the recording up on our website and share that link around with everybody that registered for the webinar next week. It looks like the Atlanta Water CCR for 2025 does not report data for PFAS. Is there another data source where we might find that answer? I think, Lauren, but feel free to chime in. The answer is no. You would have to take steps to test your own water, as Lauren recommended. Rachel came off mute, though, so maybe Rachel has another.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that part of the EPA's unregulated contaminant monitoring rule requires that municipal water systems that are testing for PFAS as a part of that rule do report the results in their annual water quality reports. So the most recent version of that rule was the fifth one, and I can't remember exactly when that monitoring cycle ended, but it was fairly recent. And of the 30 chemicals that are on the list, 29 of them are PFAS. And so the data for those chemicals should be in the past year's annual water quality reports. I also understand that the Safe Drinking Water Act regulations that are now in place they also require monitoring for the 6 PFAS that are included in the regulation. And so the data for that monitoring should also be reported in every water system's annual water quality report. And just specifically to Atlanta, I live in Atlanta, and this is something I like to keep an eye on, unsurprisingly. And I can just say that the last time I checked my Atlanta Public Water System's annual water quality report, the results for the reported PFAS were all below detection level. So that was really encouraging to see.
Oh, Jeanette, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. I just shared a link from Jesse. Jesse, do you want to share what the EPD information is?
Sure. So Georgia Environmental Protection Division actually has a pretty useful story map with some background information and then historic sampling data. You kind of have to dig through the pages to look at kind of different eras of sampling rounds, but they have some decent coverage and reports on sampling data. I think that the general threshold that they have for detect is 5 parts per trillion, particularly on the more recent data sets. And that's just things that are reported to EPD. So a local drinking water system may have other results that haven't been submitted. So sometimes just calling a water systems manager and asking questions can get you pretty far as long as you're nice.
I was actually just about to suggest the same. I looked up my report for the water system where I live in New York City, and I found it to be very thorough and kind of answered all my questions. But then I was looking up the water report for my parents' house in Virginia, and there just wasn't as much information. And so out of curiosity, I called them, and they were super helpful. It is their job to, help you out and explain. I just wanted to know, what are you testing for? Have you tested for this in the past? Do you have plans to test for this other thing in the future? What are the local regulations? What are the thresholds you're looking at? And how are you testing? And they were super helpful and explained everything to me. So if you're not shy and if you're polite, you can get a ton of information just by talking to them.
Good. All right. We are at time. So I want to thank again our panelists for their expertise and time with us today. And then thank everyone who was able to join us. We really appreciate it. And yeah, look forward to continuing to be in touch on this issue as the legislature progresses and as the science progresses. Thank you guys. Bye.